find a lot in Paul and in the Gospels, the authors are mining like Day of the Lord passages from the Old Testament and finding like the return of Jesus in these oracles that are about the coming day of the Lord. And I'm not arguing that like Jesus was doing that in all the same passages. Okay. But I do think there is an interesting feature you see in Second Temple Judaism of the reception of the Day of the Lord tradition, where it is aligned kind of with the coming of God's kingdom. And so I see a lot of, in terms of Jesus' kingdom proclamation, there's a lot of coherence there with other traditions we see about the coming day of the Lord, which I think you can tie that also to Jesus.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Tucker Ferda. He is Associate Professor of New Testament at Pittsburg Theological Seminary. We're going to be discussing his excellent new book, massive monograph entitled Jesus and His Promised Second Coming, Jewish Eschatology and Christian Origins. This book is a big deal. Tucker is laying out a really, I think, sound, persuasive historical argument that the historical Jesus did, in fact, predict his second coming. If that is news to you, of course he did. It's in the gospel as well. We unpack why that's such a big question, why many scholars have thought otherwise, and why Tucker is, of course, right. So we'll talk about that. We also get into the implications of if Jesus did predict his second coming, what does that mean for us theologically today as we're still living in this interim period between the life of Jesus and his return. So we get to that at the end, which, is a big topic, but it's an important one for us to at least touch on. If you're new to the channel or this is your first time listening on podcast, please do give us a like, a rating. That always helps us out. Share our content. Very much appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And we really appreciate it. Hope this is helpful to you. And without further ado, let's jump into our conversation with Dr. Ferda. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Really excited to have another wonderful guest today, Dr. Tucker Ferda. We're going to be discussing his new book, Jesus and His Promised Second Coming, Jewish Eschatology and Christian Origins. Tucker, super glad to have you on. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be chatting with you.
Yeah, man. Well, I'm really excited to get into this book. Fantastic study, right? It's a big, thick academic monograph, and we're going to get into unpacking some of the arguments. But first, I'd just like to give the audience a little chance to get to know you. So could you just give us maybe just a quick background in terms of like, how did you get into biblical studies? What's your current role? What do you do, kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. So I, grew up in a context where I really was interested in the Bible and was part of a Christian context where the Bible was really significant, and I loved studying the Bible. But I also really loved history, just as an interest. And I actually went to college initially to be a high school history teacher.
Oh, cool.
And so I went to Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and all students there have to take an Intro to Bible class. And so I thought I was going to be a history major, history teacher. And I remember it was like 20 minutes into the first class of Intro to Bible. And I thought, I need to go talk to my advisor and add a biblical studies major.
Nice.
I was just hooked. And I think for me, it was seeing that these two things that for me had kind of been separate my whole life, which is an interest in the Bible and an interest in history, they could actually be conjoined in biblical studies. And so I was just fascinated with that. So just continued to pursue there. I've landed at Pittsburg Seminary, where I'm really, really grateful and excited to be here. And I'm a place where I can teach things that I also research and write on, which is wonderful. So I teach courses on the Gospels and the life of Jesus, and then electives on like book studies, the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, Luke, Acts. So it's really fun for me to be in a place where I like being in a seminary context, but I'm also in a place that really values my work as a historian too. And I feel like I can really be myself here, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah, that's awesome. When you find that place where you can bring it all together and do what you love, dude, that's the best. It's not easy to find either. So that's awesome, man. Yeah. Super cool. Well, thanks for that. Let's do this, because this is the first episode we've actually had on historical Jesus stuff. And I know some of my audience will be familiar to varying degrees with historical Jesus research, but we have a pretty broad audience, and I just don't want to presuppose anything.
Huh?
And I think before we get into the intricacies of the argument of the book, it might just be helpful to kind of sit back and answer the kind of bigger question of, yeah, and maybe it's hard to do in a short time span, but could you give us just a very brief rundown of what historical Jesus research entails?
Mhm.
Because I think sometimes people, like, I don't know, my experience is whenever I talk about historical Jesus in the classroom, there's this initial kind of awkward conversation we have to have about,
Yeah.
people don't necessarily believe everything that's in the Gospels Jesus did or said, and right.
Mhm.
So anyway, yeah, if you could just give us kind of a quick,
Yeah,
your
for
kind of
sure.
quick summary. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I have a similar teaching experience actually in doing that, and so and I think for some folks, and this is an entirely unjustified assumption, but I think some people when they think about historical Jesus, they think this all stems from a kind of skepticism.
Right.
So you have historians who are like they're just not believing what's in the Bible, and so they're going to try to reconstruct something else. And of course, there are people have bias, and you can find maybe some scholars that are doing that kind of thing. But I think, like on its most charitable read, historical Jesus scholarship stems from just a close reading of our sources and trying to answer questions that emerge from a close comparative reading of our sources. So um, you take like the example of like the crucifixion scene in all four gospels. And if you're reading them carefully, they agree on kind of the gist of what had happened, but there's a lot of difference in terms of the details that are included and then the order in which things occur. And so historical Jesus scholars are really not doing anything different, maybe methodologically in a way, is what like a harmonist would do. I mean, if someone comes along and says, well, you can find a way to put all this stuff together if you just put it in the right order or whatever, that's a historical argument
Mm-hmm.
to make sense of the sources, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of historical Jesus scholars would probably disagree with that explanation, but they're doing a similar thing. They're kind of starting with close reading of our sources and then trying to infer like what past is necessary to explain like how we got to this particular point. So I think that's kind of what's going on like a method level or approach level. And then I also think too it's important just that our sources are, there's a lot of historical Jesus scholars that think there's a lot of memory, there's a lot of history in the Gospels, but just grappling with the fact that they are written 30 to 40 years after the life of Jesus, and they reflect the teaching context of the church. This is tradition that has been used in communities, and it reflects that. And so the challenge of kind of untangling memory about the past from its use, its theological use, and some of the development that might have occurred in that in between time before it was written down. That's really important for this work as well.
Yeah, great. No, that's really helpful. So it's a lot about trying to, the all the traditions we have of Jesus in the Bible are intentionally passed down to us with layers of interpretation on them. And of course, there's no such thing as any event that's uninterpreted in terms of how it's passed along. But we're trying to, as best as we can, understand the kind of career, so to speak, of Jesus of Nazareth, what the overall scope of his ministry was, and his teachings. If we could, like, yeah, for lack of a better term, if we were on the ground, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
during his ministry. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Good.
Yeah, and I think there's been a little bit of a shift in recent years with Jesus scholarship, in that I think like the 60s, 70s, 80s, like people are really trying to know like what did Jesus do and say, like
Mm-hmm.
actually do and say. That's kind of the fundamental question.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people that are still interested in that really focused question, but then other folks are like with the advent of like memory studies in the
Mm-hmm.
last 10, 20 years, people they don't think we can be quite as precise about Jesus said or did this actual thing, but we can speak more generally about it's likely Jesus spoke in this kind of way or said
Mm-hmm.
these kinds of things. And so it's actually kind of an exciting opportunity for historians to think about the tradition in light of some of those new insights.
Yeah. So it's more kind of like you can get the general gist or big picture of things, but that sort of the image that people have, like with the Jesus seminar, of the bead counter kind of approach sort of
Right.
thing,
Yeah,
is
exactly.
yeah, we can't really do that, right? Okay, good. All right, good. So let's then jump into the big issue argument of the book, and it's one that maybe would surprise people, but anybody that's engaged in historical Jesus research shouldn't be surprised by this, and that's the broad assumption, and I think it's fair to say assumption, because you show in the book it hasn't really been argued for outside of a couple books, that Jesus never spoke about his return. So he spoke about the coming of the kingdom of God, but in terms of his and maybe anticipated his death, right? But anything after that is just sort of murky. We can't say much about what Jesus thought. So what can you kind of take us through how that idea emerges within critical scholarship? Because that's sort of the wave that you're pushing back against, you're working from.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I thought, when I thought about how I wanted to map out the argument and how I wanted to progress through the book, it was important for me to, like, the part 1 of 4 is, I'm like a critical read of fairly recent scholars. So I'm looking at a couple significant figures, Glasson and Robinson, who wrote about 60 years ago or so, and I really engaged their argument. And then more recent scholarship. But then in part 2, I kind of step back to look at stuff that's even earlier, to try and unpack like some of the, I use the phrase like a plausibility structure, what plausibility structure exists in reception history, to make sense of how these views came to hold as they have. And so I think that's where I would like to start, actually, if I could. I think
please.
that's in terms of developing how this silent consensus emerges. I mean, I think there are some really bad reasons why people have not tied the second coming hope to Jesus, that stem from some of this earlier reception history stuff. And then there are some reasons that are more reasonable, that require a lot more attention, like from me, serious attention as a historian, and it's kind of on me to offer a better historical explanation. But I do think it's important to name some of those bad reasons, because they do kind of persist in some ways. You'll find them cropping up in different places. And so I was really surprised to find, as I dove into the research, that like well before Herman Samuel Romaris, who's often credited in the late 18th century as being the first historical Jesus scholar, I found a lot of Enlightenment rationalists and deists and freethinkers who are just routinely, kind of in passing, without a lot of argumentation, saying that Jesus had nothing to do with this prediction of a second coming. And so it shows that this is already kind of a view you can take for granted. I mean, even a century before Romaris is writing, and I think in that context, it's not for a good historical reason. It's because you have to be a little oversimplistic with this, but you have these Enlightenment rationalists who are not really interested in certain aspects of Christianity, particularly like the miraculous elements of it. They don't like eschatology, and so but they like Jesus, actually. And so the Jesus they find, lo and behold, tends to think a lot like they do in terms of the interest in ethics and things. And so they don't like the second coming, and the Jesus they find doesn't either. And so the whole reconstruction is kind of a way of making Jesus, as Albert Schweitzer would later say, into a modern person, right? Making him kind of think the way we think in our own time. And there's been a lot of work in Jesus research of trying to not do that, right? Even if we disagree about reconstruction. So that's one kind of bad reason. Another one that's really important for the book is how Christian scholars and exegetes have understood Jewish messianism and constructed Jewish messianism. And so I was intrigued to find this in my research, that there's a shift. I wasn't trying to be comprehensive in tracing this throughout Christian history, but there is a noticeable shift in like the 3rd or 4th centuries from Christian theologians being like, look, basically Jews and Christians agree about what the Messiah is to be and to do. The main difference between us is that as Christians, we think half of this hasn't happened yet. So you find like Tertullian says this, Justin Martyr says this. You can find this in the Pseudo-Clementine literature. Like we basically agree, but we just think some of it's still yet to come at the second coming. something happens in the 3rd or 4th century where you cease to see that argument being made. And it's more instead like a sharper discontinuity between what Christians think about the Messiah and what Jews think about the Messiah. And the way that is constructed by Christian scholars is through kind of caricature and stereotype of like a Jewish view that is earthly and terrestrial and militaristic and supernatural. And the Christian view is about like suffering for others. It's a spiritual kind of model. And so what develops is this like kind of two different, like non-reconcilable visions of what it means to be the Messiah. I could not find before the Enlightenment period ever a time where that construction of Jewish messianism was linked to the second coming. But that is what these Enlightenment rationalists are going to do. They're going to lean into this already established stereotype of Jewish messianism, and they're going to say, hey, that sounds a lot like Christian views of the second coming. We know that Jesus wasn't about that. He was about overturning that kind of carnal Jewish view of the Messiah. It was a short step to make the connection that he could not have talked about his second coming. So that's this is not just an inference, but you can see in these Enlightenment rationalist short reflections on the second coming, they'll say things like, after Jesus left the scene, his Jewish disciples kind of went back to their old ways of thinking. I mean, they lean into the kind of Jewish nature of Christian origins to explain the emergence of this view. That obviously is also a really bad idea, right? That needs to go.
Yeah, so it's basically taking everything negative in the tradition, coding it as Jewish, and then trying to distance Jesus from those aspects of it. Yeah,
right. And I think this is. I think modern scholars and even Glasson and Robinson, even though I disagree with them in several ways on this, they're still much more sensitive and careful than what you find in certainly before Amaris and even in the 19th century when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think if I could just name one more thing that I think is important is that like the fact you have like these Enlightenment rationalists that they're taking the second coming away and they're saying this has nothing to do with Jesus. A lot of 19th century lives of Jesus, they're kind of making a similar move. And so understandably in Christian circles, there's a counter reaction to this, and so you find in the 19th century just tons of literature, kind of apologetical literature from Christians doubling down on the significance of the second coming of Jesus. And I think what that does for historians is it makes this a kind of loaded topic. It creates this kind of culture war. And so 20th century historians to the present, I think, are just reticent to even step into it because they just assume, based upon reception history, that this is an inherently theological question. It's not of interest to historians, and I just find that unfortunate because that's not really, we don't, there's other things in the tradition, like the miracle tradition. There's lots of historians who might not believe that miracles can happen, but they can still offer a really robust treatment of that element of the Jesus tradition and come to some other explanation. You wouldn't just write off their work as saying, right, this is only something that theologians deal with. But for some reason, the second coming hope has not had that kind of treatment.
Yeah, that is really interesting. One of the other things that is kind of tied to this, you bring this out at a number of points in your book. There was even it was in a footnote, but even an interesting quote from John Calvin's commentary on the Synoptic Gospels, where it seems like there's an issue within the Christian theological tradition of any time that what's perceived to be a problematic view, for example, like questions about the second coming and the complex nature of that the one way that Christians try to deal with it throughout the millennia is to say, like, any mistaken views, those we would attribute to the disciples, their misunderstandings of Jesus. Jesus didn't have that misunderstanding, but the conflations of the destruction of the temple with his return and all these kind of things that gets jumbled together in the minds of the disciples. And it seemed to me like you made a pretty good point that actually created the ground for the later move that these deists and rationalists made. Yeah,
for sure.
I thought that was really interesting. Yeah,
and that as far as my research could discern, that is like a fairly modern move too. I mean, you see like in earlier times, like even like some of these pagan critics of Christianity in the second, third, fourth century, they kind of group Jesus and the disciples together as like they're all messed up,
Hmm.
right? You don't find that they're kind of this attempt to distinguish Jesus
Hmm.
as like the truth of his teaching from his later messed up followers. That's a later modern thing, and it's really tied with kind of modern Christian identity construction, like with the case of the deists, like they're in separating Jesus from the disciples. They're identifying with Jesus, and they're identifying those Christians in their own time they don't like or don't agree with the mistaken disciples. And
Hmm.
so it's a way of kind of carving out what it means to be a Christian in a modern context.
Yeah, you can kind of follow Jesus, get away from the church. Sort of. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right, right, right.
Uh, so
Um,
what are some of the stronger
yeah,
arguments
good.
then?
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. So this I think you see more in the 20th century, and I talk about somewhere these like three streams of eschatological tradition or different streams of interpretation you find in New Testament scholarship as it pertains to this. And there's a lot more to be said on this front. So I think one of the streams is where I would like locate Albert Schweitzer in his important work in the early 20th century, where he's taking a lot of the eschatological material in the Gospels, especially about the coming of the Son of Man and the coming of the judgment and things. And he's, first of all, understanding this stuff literally. So
Hmm.
he's thinking that the best way to understand this in its Jewish context is to say, right, the Son of Man is like a celestial figure who really is going to come. This is not like apocalyptic symbolism, but this is the description of things that are going to occur. That's like an important interpretive move that is made. And then he's making the historical argument to say, and this stuff goes back to Jesus.
Hmm.
Um, so that's kind of one extra of the different spectrum of these three views. That's kind of on one side of this thing. Even within Schweitzer's view, though, and those who I would put in his camp, even more recent critics like E.P. Sanders and Paula Fredrickson and Dale Allison, for instance, they are there is still not room in this model, though, for the second coming. So Schweitzer has a kind of Jesus who has an imminent eschatology
Hmm.
and expects the coming of the kingdom very soon. But he isn't really talking about his own return after an interim period, after a time of absence. And critics who are in this tradition are similarly not really making that argument. So when they talk about imminence, they're really talking about the coming of the kingdom. They think Jesus is talking about the coming of the kingdom, and the church is the group that has made this further leap, to include Jesus in that in some kind of way.
Hmm. So,
That is
in other words, like Jesus predicted the coming of the kingdom, and maybe that was going to come. He ends up dying, and then the church adds on the return of Jesus because obviously the kingdom hasn't come, so we have to have some sort of.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I try to show in the first part is that there's actually some really interesting disagreement among, say, Allison, Sanders, and Fredrickson on this very question. So the view you just described, Max, I would say that's like Paula Fredrickson's view, because she actually makes the case that Jesus did not really anticipate and talk about dying before arriving in Jerusalem for his final Passover. This kind of took him by surprise. And so that, even though I disagree with that view, that actually it makes good sense kind of in the system that she has created. Jesus didn't expect he was going to die. He certainly wasn't talking about coming after a period of absence, right? Allison and Sanders are a little bit different because they both have this sense of imminent eschatology in their reconstructions of Jesus. But both of them are also very clear that they think Jesus expected he would die in Jerusalem, or he was in some way making sense of that beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that they never really connect the dots between how that belief on Jesus's part connects with his sense of imminent eschatology.
Mm-hmm.
And so my own, before getting to those other two streams, I mean, this is the stream in which I would place myself as
Mm-hmm.
well. But I'm trying to kind of work out what I see as some like unexplored areas in the Schweitzerian stream of tradition, some unresolved questions that emerge in other reconstructions. I mean, I think a lot of the scholarship, this is true for Sanders and Allison and Fredrickson and many others, when they're doing a lot of their formative work on eschatology in the Gospels, their main interlocutors are like the Jesus Seminar and people that do not believe that eschatology really has anything to do with Jesus at all. So the discussion of eschatology in some ways remains on a kind of global level, because they're just trying to make the basic case that Jesus is an eschatological prophet. I mean, I think that debate has won, but now it's time to kind of go in a little more depth in the weeds of like, hey, what is the actual eschatology, imminent eschatology that we can trace back to Jesus?
Good.
That's kind of where I fit in there.
Yeah, good.
And then briefly, just the other two streams that are also really important and require my own engagement with. I think on the other side of the other extreme from Schweitzer and friends is maybe the Jesus Seminar is a good example that actually, interestingly, agree on the interpretive level that a lot of this eschatological stuff in the Gospels we should read literally, right? Where they disagree is on the historical reconstruction part. So they're going to say, yeah, this coming of the Son of Man really refers to like this figure coming and the judgment and so on. But Jesus didn't talk about that at all. That's all from the early church. So on a kind of exegetical level, there's some interesting similarity, but historical reconstruction wise, there's different. And then in the middle somewhere, I would put like folks of the likes of N.T. Wright or George Caird, who really disagree first on an interpretive level, where they think that the scholars have misunderstood the kind of the meaning of this language, and us taking it literally, we're not properly understanding the symbolic kind of coded nature of apocalyptic language. They're going to tie almost all of that material to the historical Jesus, but just say he wasn't talking about his second coming. He was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem or his own exaltation or vindication after death or some other thing. So you can see there that like my own argument has to address really things in all three of those streams, right? And that emerge both on like a historical reconstruction level, but also the interpretive level. So part 3 of the book is really where, because I mean, Wright obviously raises really important questions about the interpretation of this stuff. It's on me to make a better argument of how I think there's a better reading of this stuff on a more literal level. So I try to do that with like Paul and the Gospels before ever getting to my historical reconstruction.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe later we can look at an example or something just to give people a sense of that, because that is a big. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later, because I think that's a big. There's various parts to that, right? As you said, there's the interpretation of apocalyptic literature, and then there's the implications of what different interpretations will lead to in terms of theology and stuff. So yeah, it's a big topic. But I appreciate the way you tackled it, and really, you make a great point in the book that we are all wrapped up in modern kind of post-Enlightenment framework as historians, as scholars, and we have to do a job of kind of thinking through that and sifting through that. So, you engage. I think you do a good job of engaging with Tom's work, his Gifford lectures, which is very much in that stream of history, theology, and all that kind of stuff. And you happen to come to different conclusions than him, but you're having that conversation. You both agree that we can't act like the historical scholarship that's been done in the last 300 years or something is just neutral and it doesn't have like layers of presuppositions baked into it. So I think that's really helpful.
I totally agree with Wright in his comment in those lectures where he says that like for a long time New Testament scholars have operated with kind of little awareness of the larger cultural scene.
Right.
This phrase, the larger cultural scene in which this stuff is happening. And I agree with that. I just think I would identify a different cultural scene. And articulate its influence differently, but his point is well taken.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, right, it's always easy in hindsight to see how other people's views are affected by their cultural environment. It's always more difficult to recognize it for ourselves, right? And so, you do, I think, fairly raise some questions about how his view might also be affected by his cultural environment. So
if I'm lucky to be around, in 10 or 20 years and still doing this and teaching, I'm sure I'm going to have a student come and say, hey,
yeah, for sure.
I didn't realize this,
it's a reality of life. So that's good. Okay. So, the big proposal then is, Jesus does that. The historical Jesus did speak about an interim period after his death. So not just following Sanders, Allison, that Jesus, did discuss his imminent death, but that in fact he also predicted that there would be this interim period of a somewhat indefinite nature, but within generally a generation or so, that the Son of Man, Jesus, the Son of Man, would return. So you're identifying those Son of Man statements as Jesus speaking of himself as the Son of Man also. Yeah, okay, good. So can you just walk us through what you see as kind of like the basics of the argument? Obviously,
Yeah.
Takes many chapters to unpack, but how would you kind of give us the Cliff Notes version of that?
Definitely. And if I'm kind of getting off, just say, hey, reel it in here a little bit. But I mean, I think before I look at any text or mention any particular text, I think there's like a really important like methodological thing that I would want to really stress, which is that which kind of emerges from that postmodern kind of historiography you'd mentioned, right? And I think this is a really important insight that has emerged, which is like, we can, to be a little overgeneral about it, but like if we think of history moving forward in time, right, in terms of sequence of things, historians have to work backwards in time, right? So we can never forget the fact that like we are in front of the sources, right? And the past for us is always this unknown thing that we don't know, and it has to be based on probable inferences about the past, given the very fragmentary evidence that has been preserved. And so what that means methodologically is a pretty basic point, but I try to be really consistent in how I apply it, which is like we really need to be careful to start with our sources and really being careful about like what are the claims of our sources. Like let's not like just if you only pick a few of the sources and really prioritize those claims and reconstruct Jesus on the basis of that, you're not looking at the scope of sources that we have preserved. So part 3 is a lengthy like exegetical portion where I'm just trying to reconstruct like what are Jesus followers saying about this in our different sources that have been preserved. And then only on the basis of those claims can we make inferences about what the past likely is, that what past gave rise to that.
Okay, that's helpful. And maybe just to put a pin on that for listeners and viewers, what often happens in this kind of stuff is people try to reconstruct a Jewish view or several Jewish views based on very fragmentary sources, and then they try to decide which of those Jesus held. What you're suggesting is that's highly problematic because the evidence itself is fragmentary. It's not that we can't do that. I mean, you can do that to an extent. But what ends up happening there is you kind of limit your options, and you're saying, well, we have all these sources about what Christians believed very shortly after the life of Jesus. We have to at least lay those out and say, here's what they're saying. And then we can talk about how did we get from Jesus to that kind of, is that fair?
Exactly. Okay. I mean, so like a way of a contrast there, Glasson and Robinson and their important studies that I look at in detail in part 1, they start with what they say is like the Jewish background.
Right.
And then they have kind of what like the limits of what is possible based upon how they reconstruct that. And then they're already evaluating like the literature that comes from the Jesus movement on the basis of that, which is like, in the case of like Glasson's work, I mean, he's writing this before we know the full extent of the Dead Sea collection.
Yeah, if we know anything now, we basically know that you almost can't say X view is impossible for a Jew to have in the first century, because the more evidence we've gathered, the more we just recognize mass diversity in terms
of the variety and the diversity of messianic expectation. So I think that makes it really problematic to start there. So I want to start with claims from these sources and then try to contextualize the best that we can. There is room for that context to push back. If Christians are saying things, they're like, we really cannot find any potential parallels from the Second Temple period. Like that's a significant insight, but I don't think that's the case, as I get into later when it comes to this particular view. So that's like the kind of fundamental methodological kind of premise of the book that I try to trace out. And I think the implication of that, though, is that like it cuts through some rather silly arguments about like the burden of proof that sometimes emerge in this, like people that'll be like, you're the one making a historical argument for something going back to Jesus. The burden of proof is on you to do that. Other people saying, no, like you're being skeptical of the tradition. The burden of proof is on you to say why you're not. No, I mean, Sanders has a great line somewhere, which is like, the burden of proof is on anyone making any argument about anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's certainly, I have the burden of proof is on me to demonstrate that all this data is, we can connect in some way to this historical figure. But for other proposals that are maybe, say, only tying a small fragment of that early Christian witness to Jesus, the claims of our sources to Jesus, they also have to explain where the rest of this material came from. So I'm trying to make a case that, like, it's really unavoidable for historians to talk about Christian origins in general. You can't just just reconstruct a Jesus based upon certain things and then just be like, well, it's not on me to explain where the rest of this material came from. That's a problem with your own model. That's a problem with your own argument if you can't explain where that emerges from. So I'm trying to say, here's my proposal. Here's where I've landed. People might see it differently, but hopefully I've raised the point that, like, this does merit, like, more attention from historians to explain where they think this idea came from.
Great.
So yeah. And then in terms of, like, key steps of the argument, I would say, the first thing is just, I try to show that this expectation for Jesus to return or to appear again, there's all kinds of different terms that emerge, but it's really just everywhere. It's all over the place in the literature that we have. And I have a couple chapters where I look at Paul, and I'm interested in Paul, not like Paul's theology of the return of Jesus per se, but I'm really interested in, like, what we can infer about the wider Jesus movement from what Paul is doing in his letters. And I just find it fascinating that here you have a figure who's engaged in all kinds of disputes about Gentiles and circumcision and Torah observance, and he's having to defend his view. He's having to return to the scriptures to make arguments because other Jesus followers disagree. We never see that when it comes to his expectation for Christ to return again. I mean, there's only a couple places, 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4, where he gives us a little more of a window into what he thinks about this. But he's only bringing those up because there's other issues he's trying to address in these contexts. And he's talking about the return of Jesus as a way of addressing, say, people grieving about those who have died in Thessalonian correspondence, or, some problem with the resurrection in 1 Corinthians. So that this just shows me that, like, Paul is not unique in his view of the return of Jesus. And it's something that I think, even in contexts where there's dispute, he can kind of assume that he and his readers are on the same page about this. And there's no kind of anxiety that there are other teachers in the Jesus movement that are out there that think something fundamentally different about this. He's not having to make a case. So that's just, we're talking about a couple decades away from the ministry of Jesus. And this kind of seems to be the sense you get, right, from Paul's letters. And I want to account for that in some way. I've got to explain how that could ever possibly arise, that situation, when there's all kinds of other things that early Jesus followers are disagreeing about. And I think in the Thessalonians correspondence, I'm interested in the claims, again, not necessarily the historicity of this, but I think Paul, when he says by word of the Lord, and he kind of paraphrases this teaching about the return of Jesus and the general resurrection, I think Paul thinks, at least, that he's referring to something Jesus talked about. And so, of course, that might not be the case. Modern historians might be in the right in saying, no, this is from some kind of prophet speaking by the inspiration of the Spirit or something else. Maybe that's true historically, but I think that would be news for Paul if he were to hear that conclusion of modern New Testament scholars. I think he's trying to comfort this church by saying, look, Jesus had something to say about this situation, right?
Yeah. So Paul, your argument is that Paul himself transmits Jesus' tradition about his return. That's your reading of it? Yes,
it is. Yeah, and not necessarily that I am arguing that all of that goes back to the historical Jesus as written, but it's significant in terms of tradition that you have a figure who's at least understanding this material about the return and thinking that it accurately represents the teaching of the founding figure, right? And is able to draw on it when circumstances require. I just think that's a really significant thing, and it's remarkable to me that in historical Jesus scholarship, where there's so much hand-wringing already about how bad our sources are and how Paul doesn't talk about so much of the Jesus tradition, that in our earliest letter,
Mm-hmm.
we can have this thing by word of the Lord that is like, does not get as much attention.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a fascinating thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I talk about Paul. That's kind of the main conclusion from the stuff on Paul. And then I look at all four Gospels
Mm-hmm.
to look at the claims of the Gospels. And I try to argue there, kind of more in that Schweizerian stream, perhaps, that the best way to understand this eschatological language in each of these Gospels is on a more literal level. And Jesus seems to be identifying himself with the Son of Man figure. Again, this has nothing to do with historicity. I'm just trying to say, like, when Matthew's compiling this stuff,
Mm-hmm.
Matthew could be wrong about what this stuff means, but it seems pretty likely that Matthew at least understands this stuff to refer to the return of Jesus. So too Mark, so too Luke. And I think even in the Gospel of John, even though it has a much more heightened realized eschatology, it's not a completely different eschatology. And you can find some glimmers in there of future
Mm-hmm.
hope that have kind of hung on. So we're talking about like all of our main sources for reconstructing Jesus. This is not like a fringe belief kind of in the way they've constructed their story of Jesus. And there's just a lot of material about this too. It doesn't come down to just a couple passages here and there that have gotten a lot of the attention about this. There's all kinds of parable tradition. There's kind of one-off sayings and things that really seem to assume that the readers are understanding this on the basis of like, hey, Jesus was in the past. He did these things. He talked about things that refer to our own time. He also talked about things that refer to the future for us.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole symbolic world of the Gospels seem to presuppose that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That also needs to be accounted for. So,
yeah. Good.
So that's kind of the claim part of the argument. And then I go into making inferences about the past on the basis of those claims and try to infer the most probable, reconstruction on that basis. And so I do a little bit at the beginning of part 4 we can't do a ton of this because the nature of our sources, but we like just with the synopsis, we can compare a little bit and see like how Matthew has used Mark
Mm-hmm.
and how Luke has used Mark. I'm still one of these people holding on to the Q hypothesis. So I also,
Mm-hmm.
I think we can do a little bit there with Q, even though we have to be a lot more careful and hypothetical with our reconstructions. But the thing that I find is that Matthew, I think, is changing stuff in Mark in terms of this eschatological material. There's some growth in the tradition, but it's always a change like in kind. It's not a change from like a really good way to put this, I think, is like I can find no example ever in the gospel tradition where you have a saying from an earlier source or a tradition that is not about this return of Jesus. And then in a later source, it suddenly becomes about that. In other words, you don't see the growth in that movement of like non-parousia stuff becoming parousia stuff.
Yeah.
If anything, the direction goes in the other way, right? Or the movement goes. So like a good example of this is the Gospel of Luke. So Luke has, in the Gospel of Mark, after Peter's confession, there's this famous prediction that's much debated that Jesus says, there's some standing here who will not taste death right before they see the kingdom has come in power. And right before that, in the line before, he talks about the Son of Man coming with the angels.
Mm-hmm.
Luke, interestingly, rewrites that line in Mark to say that there are some here standing here who will see the kingdom of God. And so Luke, in my view, kind of takes out the parousia stuff and realizes this eschatology a little bit more to refer to something like after the resurrection or something else. It has a slightly different referent. But that's the movement, right? I think Luke does a similar thing with the reply to Caiaphas. So in Mark 14, I read the reply to Caiaphas in Mark is Jesus is predicting a return. You will see. But Luke takes out the Daniel 7 stuff.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? The trial. But then he has it in Stephen's martyrdom account in Acts.
That's right. Yeah, that's true.
It's very, but it's different because Stephen sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. So the emphasis is not as much, I guess, on the return there as his current session. But I don't know.
Sure. I mean, and I guess so. In a way, there is some parity there with the reply to Caiaphas and Luke's version, because it seems to me that by taking out the coming of the Son of Man stuff from Daniel 7, for Luke it seems to be more about, like, he leans more into the Psalm 110 aspect of that.
Right.
by taking out the Daniel 7 stuff, which again is important witness, but what we see there is like a change of the tradition, but it's not a move to like ratchet up the eschatology as it pertains to the return of Jesus. If anything, it's like a softening of that.
Yeah, I think you have that a bit in Luke. I take that point, and in fact also Luke's version of the, his reworking of Mark 13, right? I've always felt like that version of Jesus' teaching is the most amenable to the kind of cared right, the Dodd cared right school. Whether or not you go that way, I always felt like Luke's account is most easily read in that kind of like Jesus is just talking about the destruction of the temple and the vindication of the Son of Man kind of thing. But anyway, so it just kind of adding to your point there. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, okay, I guess one counter to that, just to be, for the sake of trying to be fair and give you some pushback. What do you think then about? So you have Mark 13, the so-called little apocalypse. Matthew's version, Matthew 24. The question the disciples ask Jesus does supplement that. What will be all these things and the coming? What I forget the exact language. The coming of the age or something like that. What's the exact?
It's some language drawn from Daniel. I can't recall off the top of my head either. But you're right. It's
I can look it up.
So my I think that, I mean, because even in Mark, the question from the disciples is still kind of awkwardly phrased, as you well know. And so I'm more in the camp of like Joel Marcus, that thinking that their question goes beyond, right? So it's like in Mark, if I'm remembering right, it's like, when will this be?
Yeah, I can read it first for everybody, just so we have it, because I have the two here. So Mark 13. Sorry, I had Matthew up. I'll read Mark first and then Matthew, just so that we're on the same page. This Mark 13, what is it? 4, I think. Let me see. Hold on. Sorry, I should have had this up. Yeah, Mark 13:4. We have, tell us, when will this be? Because you just talked about the destruction of the temple, not one stone being left on the other. So Mark 13:4, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things, twice tauta, are about to be accomplished? So he just spoke about the destruction of the temple, and then one could argue the tauta there is strictly about the destruction of the temple. Anyway, we can get into that. But then just to add to that, the Matthean version reads this way. This is Matthew 24:3. The disciples ask him, they say, tell us, when will this happen? So same as Mark, but then catch this. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Right. Yeah. So Matthew seems to be quite the tauta in Mark gets a little bit further explanation in Matthew.
Yeah, great. So I mean, I think the question there is the Matthew's clarification, is it just deepening what is already there in Mark, or is Matthew going in another direction? And I think if we were only looking at the Mark 13:4, it is genuinely ambiguous. But I think the deeper we get into this apocalypse, there are like structuring words that appear, like after the abomination of desolation stuff, like then after that suffering, when we get into the signs that suggest to me that like the predictions of the coming of the Son of Man and the kind of cosmic signs in heaven via those structuring words are like clearly not synonymous with stuff that was just previously described. There's some kind of further something that happens next. So I think like even the temporal language of like, and then, and then, and then, and Matthew really maintains these kind of structural features of Mark 13. And Matthew, I always think for the kind of Cardian reading of Mark 13 really struggles with the final parable in Mark about the owner of a house going away, right? Which seems to me a pretty thinly veiled allegory about the return of Jesus, which would kind of be weird, right? If like he hadn't talked about it at all until that parable. So I think Matthew's clarifying, as he often does with Mark.
I agree. I think Matthew often clarifies Mark. Yeah.
But
that's good.
But in many ways on the same page, though, in terms of the kind of two things that are being predicted in Mark 13, the destruction of the temple and kind of what is after that.
Good. Yeah, I just wanted to add that in as a counterpoint, just for the sake, and it's helpful too for our audience just to hear some different text and all that. Good. Okay. All right. Sorry, didn't want to derail your argument.
No.
So you're moving through. That was gospel texts. Yeah. Okay. So then I guess getting back to then from there to Jesus.
Yeah. So the on the claim level, this is where I was. We're talking about tradition history, and so there we can identify change, but it seems to be a change in kind rather than the remaking of stuff into something wholly new. And for me, what this means historically is like, it kind of cuts in two different ways. It means as a historian, like, because I can see change in Matthew's use of Mark, it makes me very skeptical of my ability to reconstruct like the actual words of Jesus, because I'm peering into a very small window in the transmission of the tradition here. But I don't think what Matthew's doing to Mark is qualitatively different from what Mark was doing with whatever Mark's sources were. Right. I'm kind of taking this as like, this is a kind of window into the transmission of tradition. If indeed Mark is doing something similar with whatever Mark's sources were, I mean, my ability to get back to what Jesus actually said, I mean, it's going to be hard to do that. But at the same token, the idea that Mark is going to be making this tradition into something wholly new, that's not what we see in the rest of the tradition. So I can, on the one hand, like, it kind of reinforces something you see in other Jesus scholarship of like, you can find like a gist of the tradition, or you can find like consistent themes or impressions, right? Which we can think we can make arguments about that going back to Jesus, even if we're not really certain of or want to make the case that Jesus actually said or did this particular thing. So when I look at tradition history, that's kind of where I'm at. So I'm not making arguments anywhere in this book about like Jesus actually said this thing in Mark 14:62. Like, I'm not even trying to do that argument. I'm trying to say that the impression we get has a good sense of capturing, stuff that Jesus talked about. And then let's see. I think I move next to look at some recurring things that appear in the tradition that I think we have good reason to tie to Jesus. Specifically, just how much Daniel 7 is, and how kind of deeply intertwined it is with the eschatology of the Gospels and really all layers of the tradition, however we would reconstruct that. And it's just makes it very hard, I think, to argue that after Jesus is off the scene, his followers kind of designed the Son of Man Christology from Daniel 7 and like retrojected that as early and as widespread in the tradition as that would need to be for it to appear in the way that it does. I mean, if that is indeed the case, I think we would need to be honest about the fact that like these sources are not very helpful for us to reconstruct Jesus. If they are so if they're so open to fictionalization early on in the tradition, that's a really. But I don't in fact think that is the case. I think you can make a good argument that the Son of Man stuff goes back to, and it's not just Son of Man stuff. There's lots of other things from Daniel about like the transferring of the kingdom. Even some of the parables of Jesus seem to draw on some of Daniel's imagery of like the great tree from earlier visions in Daniel. So there's lots of Daniel stuff, which I want to argue that has an origin in some way in the teaching of Jesus. And then I also want to argue that I find a lot in Paul and in the Gospels, the authors are mining like day of the Lord passages from the Old Testament and finding like the return of Jesus in these oracles that are about the coming day of the Lord. And I'm not arguing that like Jesus was doing that in all the same passages. Okay. But I do think there is an interesting feature you see in Second Temple Judaism of the reception of the Day of the Lord tradition, where it is aligned kind of with the coming of God's kingdom. And so I see a lot of, in terms of Jesus' kingdom proclamation, there's a lot of coherence there with other traditions we see about the coming day of the Lord, which I think you can tie that also to Jesus. And I see in like messianic speculation in the Second Temple period. I mean, it's the case that like there are lots of texts that in the Old Testament are expecting like God to do something on the day of the Lord. And in reception, there's this kind of co-agency thing that's happening where you find some kind of messianic eschatological redeemer figure who's like co-participating in that. I mean, you find this all over the place where you find like in 11Q Melchizedek, right? You have like the day of the Lord's favor becomes the day of Melchizedek's favor, right? Or in Psalms of Solomon 17, you have stuff about like the nations coming to see, in Isaiah 66, it's coming to see the glory of the Lord. In Psalms of Solomon 17, they're coming to see the glory of the Messiah, right? So this is what we see, the fact we see early Christians kind of mining these texts that are putatively about God and finding messianic activity. There's actually a much more widespread tradition there and aligns with a bunch of stuff we also find in the Gospels.
Good.
Okay, and then should I just keep going with some other?
Yeah. Like maybe the connection. I guess the connection with if I think one of the things you argue really persuasively is if Jesus does in fact talk about his death, which the tradition seems to be pretty solid. I mean, one could argue differently, but many scholars would agree with that Jesus does in fact talk about his death. And so I think the move that you make that's so persuasive is that if he's thinking about his death, why is it so out of bounds that he might be thinking about a return or a second coming? And you kind of place that in light of other dialogue within Jewish tradition. So maybe could you just walk us through briefly that as well? Because I think that's a part of the book that is really really helpful.
Yeah, I mean there's just so much material kind of on this level that pertains to this, and again, like not necessarily arguing all of this goes back to Jesus as written, right. But I mean there's a lot of tradition here that had to come from somewhere. And so I'm arguing that it does not really fundamentally mistake Jesus in this way. And there's other arguments I make about the likelihood that Jesus would have anticipated, if not like serious opposition in Jerusalem, but likely his death. And there's been some other interesting books on Jesus recently that have entertained a similar. I mean, James Crossley and Robert Miles, their recent book on Jesus, kind of makes a similar argument, and that like a kind of martyr, like this martyr tradition in the Second Temple period, and they think Jesus kind of had this complex as well. So. But I do find that in the tradition, but in terms of contextualizing it, there's something really interesting that has really not been investigated much by New Testament scholars, which is this expectation for the return of the return in the future of figures from the past.
Right.
At the end time. And so it's most commonly known with like Elijah, the famous example of Elijah, right? And there's a much broader tradition there of like people that escaped death and were taken to heaven and are expected to return again at the end time. But I was really intrigued to find that's just part of this tradition. And it's much wider in the sense that you even have the expectation for people in the past who died, that they would return again at the end time. So you find traditions about like Jeremiah is a really interesting example. I think there's examples of this with Moses. I think there's examples of this with David in later rabbinic literature. So this just goes to show that if Jesus is expecting and talks about himself as like a prophet in some way, right, experiencing opposition, there is a kind of ready tradition that's there. And I think it shows up on a popular level. There's clues in the Gospels that people are understanding things on the, they're thinking about returning prophetic figures. That is out there. I think it makes sense of what Jesus is doing. It's there to use.
Right. And so if he, to put it simply, if he sees himself as the Son of Man-like figure mentioned in Daniel 7, he could be understanding that Son of Man figure as the one who needs to be handed over, killed, and then return, the one who comes and returns, basically. That's
Yeah.
kind of
I
sorry.
mean, I think this is, I, I do a little bit of investigation in the three famous passion predictions as they appear in Mark and as they're
Yeah.
received by the others. And I think Isaiah 53 might be in there in some of these cases, but Daniel 7 is, I think, very much in play in these. I mean, in the sense of the experience of the holy ones of the Most High being under being trampled and oppressed by the kind of final beast. This is part of the scenario. It's not just about victory and the giving of the kingdom, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's also suffering involved in this, and so that's really intriguing, actually. If the gospel authors are drawing from the same kind of passage in Scripture to talk both about
Mm-hmm.
suffering, right, in an eschatological frame too, right, and then to talk about eventual triumph. I don't think that is necessarily something distant from Jesus himself.
Yeah.
I think you can do that without drawing on. I'm a little agnostic, and I didn't have the energy to dive into Isaiah 53 stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that's really necessary to make the case that I'm arguing here in terms of Jesus thinking about and maybe even theologizing his upcoming death beforehand.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So at the end of the day, it seems to me like, I mean, I'm very convinced by your argument. I think you've made a very persuasive case. But it seems to me you kind of lay it out there with the implication of, like, I don't know, if we apply Occam's razor, right, to this whole thing, what's more plausible, that this stuff has its origin in Jesus talking about his second coming, or that somehow the church invented this very early on, and it's just in every layer of the tradition. You can't get away from it. Given the historical context, given all the traditions, which one makes more sense? And if we apply Occam's razor, it does seem to be, it seems to make a lot more sense if it goes back to Jesus. I don't know. What would you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really well put. And I think it kind of goes back to the methodological point earlier, which is like the best reconstructions are the ones that make the most sense of the most data.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So maybe there is another way to make sense of all this, but I feel like the scenario that I've constructed, there's really not a big like chunk of material. Like, well, what do you do with this?
Mm-hmm.
Right. How does this fit? I think because I think there is a lot of stuff in that Schweizerian stream of tradition.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty compelling in its treatment of certain features of the tradition, but it has to ignore a lot of stuff in the Gospels, or
Mm-hmm.
just not treat a lot of stuff in the Gospels. I mean, I think it's problematic for like Sanders' position, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's really skeptical of the sayings tradition for understandable reasons, but he hardly talks about the parables of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just really problematic, I think, because there's just so much of that material in the Gospels. You've got to account for it in some way. You can argue it's not historical, but you need to explain like how, like by what mechanism are early Christians writing up all this material, right,
Mm-hmm.
and putting it in the tradition in the way that it appears.
Right.
I don't think there's a better explanation for that.
Good. All right. You've convinced me. So Jesus predicted his second coming. Now, here's the big question, that is probably the hardest one, or most complex to think through, is the theological implications of your study. This is not a work of constructive theology. It's a historical Jesus project. So the aim is to come up with the best explanation for the data of what we think Jesus said. And I think you've done that really well. So the standard line in this kind of Schweizerian line of eschatology, if I could put it really bluntly, would be that Jesus wrongly predicted the end of the world. So he got that wrong. And then on top of that, the church wrongly predicted his return. And so then, as Schweitzer says, like church history, all of church history is a footnote to the delay of the parousia. And we've kind of always been dealing with that, that reality. If we take your line, basically we get rid of that first part, right? Jesus, of making Jesus wrong in that sense. But it still leaves us with this reality that Jesus discussed, that he would return within a generation. And I think one of the reasons why, I'm not saying this is why Tom Wright comes to his answer. I think he genuinely has done his homework and is convinced by Caird's analysis of apocalyptic language and kind of that whole stream, why they are convinced that Jesus never talked about his return, but he talked about the kingdom and his vindication broadly, which I guess just pertains to his ascension, and then maybe the coming of the Son of Man in a sense of judgment over the priesthood that had that sentenced Jesus to death or whatever. The advantage of that whole line, right? And people have written arguments about this, because a lot of Christians are like, what the heck? What is Wright talking about? Kind of thing. Like, of course, Jesus was talking about his second coming and everything. But then, people write, I've seen popular level explanations of this with precisely this point, is actually we kind of need that to be right, because because that way Jesus didn't get anything wrong, right? If that's from an apologetics perspective, that's the attractiveness of that argument, that all Jesus talked about was the destruction of the temple and his vindication, the coming of the Son of Man being his ascension to the throne in heaven, and the judgment on the temple. Nothing else. So that kind of solves it. But if you're correct, we do have this tradition where Jesus talks about him coming back in a generation, which does not appear to have happened, unless I'm missing something. So, what do we do with that theologically? I'd be curious. I mean, you teach in a seminary, so I know you've talked about this with students. How do you navigate that?
Yeah. This is the question I hope you didn't ask, Max. This is the one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important to say that in many ways I have thoughts about this, and I have certainly thought about it deeply, but I also feel certainly out of my element in offering like a really sophisticated theological response to this. And so I'm interested in how theologians think about this. I mean, and how theologians have thought about this since Bultmann. I think a lot of Bultmann's project really is trying to grapple with the consequences of a Schweizerian Jesus. And he's doing it in ways that a lot of scholars have moved on with, but he's clearly wrestling with something. I don't have any really great thoughts about this, but a couple things to contextualize it maybe. I do think that this is not unique. What I'm arguing about Jesus, this is not unique to even in the Bible. I mean, I think it's hard to talk about the book of Daniel and Daniel's reception of Jeremiah and other things without talking about just the way in which you have texts that are expecting a certain future, and then subsequent interpreters come on, and for whatever reason, they kind of revise that scenario. I see this as kind of part of the biblical project, For Christians, it carries a little more weight because we're not talking about another text. And I think even, there's some Christians that might say, well, I can even deal with the fact that Paul was maybe wrong about this. But when you're talking about Jesus, it means something different. And I understand that, but I think we need to take a kind of bigger picture of this is not something that's entirely unique. I think, so that's the first thing I'd say. I would also say, I do disagree with the kind of portrait of Jesus that emerges in Albert Schweitzer's work. And I don't want to say everyone kind of in that stream, but in some, Jesus is an eschatological prophet kind of in a narrow sense, meaning this is really what he was about, was going around telling people that the end was going to happen around the corner. And so if that is kind of fundamental to what he is about, then I think that the failure of this prediction, to put it bluntly, it carries a little more weight if this is crucial to this, right? I see, I'm not trying to slight this, but I think that there's a lot more in the tradition. I think this was part of the proclamation, but I think that in the final part of the book, I talk about process eschatology a little bit, and some stuff where you find in Second Temple period where this very common view, even eschatological scenarios that differ very much, but this view that like the end's not going to come like all at once.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's this idea of like inauguration and process and things. And so
the term the last days, there's evidence that it refers to a period of time,
exactly,
not like a couple days or something
exactly.
like that.
I think that's a really good example. And so I think there's a lot of stuff in the tradition where he's not just talking about the future, but I think there's a lot of stuff in the tradition that's hard to account for unless you think he's claiming things are kind of happening, that this process is kind of in motion. And I think I think there's evidence, not a ton of evidence, but I think it's just kind of, there's a view out there that like things are going to wrap up shortly. And so Jesus is not unique in thinking this. I think you find it in the Qumran sect, there's a similar kind of eschatological view, even though there's room for like a generation. There's a kind of, it's not like going to happen overnight, but I think this is just part of kind of the world in which Jesus worked, which is not to explain it away, but it's just to show that it's part of him being, a fully human figure in this context. And then if I could turn even more theological, maybe I would say, and again, this is where I don't know if this is really well thought through, but personally, at least, I think about this in terms of the incarnation and the extent of the incarnation. I remember a number of years ago, I read a really interesting article by Raymond Brown in CBQ that has like a very Raymond Brown-like title. It's something like, "What Did Jesus Know?" or something. And he says I was fascinated. It's a brilliant article, but he has a line in there he found in Cyril of Alexandria, of all people, right? So here's like the champion of like the Chalcedonian Christology. And he has this line he found where he says, that for love of us, Christ he kind of stooped to assume all of what is common to us, including ignorance, that he mentions. Now, that's not to say that Cyril would not be perhaps offended by what modern historical Jesus scholars are saying, or I'm saying, but I think there are resources in the tradition, theological resources in the tradition, to make sense of this kind of thing.
Yeah. Was that a commentary on the whole the son? No one knows the hour, not only the Father.
No, when I saw that, and I didn't trace it down. I'm not sure exactly where he had found. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. But yeah.
Yeah. You find it really interesting. I mean, it's that whole human divine aspect, the mystery of the incarnation. When people in tradition try to deal with that over time, like you get the whole kind of logos Christology, the logos, the Son, kind of feigns ignorance for our sake, or the other hand is like, no, this is him fully embracing humanity, like he's speaking as a human here. Anyway, it's it's really interesting. One thing that really, it's kind of funny. I don't know if you know this, but or my listeners do, but right when I had finished my PhD, I was also working for Tom Wright, actually as his research assistant. And it just so happens he was writing this big article on the delay of the parousia. So like one of the things he had asked me to do is just kind of like look into the sources. And so I spent a lot of time just kind of trying to get my hands on all the kind of the patristic commentary and everything that I could on, Mark 13 in parallel. So it's mostly focused on Matthew's version for obvious reasons. But one thing that really struck me from that exercise was there wasn't like uniform interpretation of these texts. You can find different kind of moves going on, spiritualizing, allegorizing, historicizing, just variety of different things. But what I didn't see was any anxiety about the delay of the parousia. I didn't see if you take the line of the kind of Schweitzer line, you would expect to see the kind of neurotic church just constantly obsessed with why hasn't he come back yet, and how our entire faith is crumbling because he was wrong, and all that. You don't find that, and that really fascinated me, because I think there are ways that if you come at it from sort of like a hermeneutic of trust, you can make all kinds of moves as you receive this tradition that don't force you to kind of end up in a place of despair. Like, well,
Mm.
it was wrong. It was wrong. Therefore, chuck it, kind of thing. That way of thinking just never occurred to ancient
Mm.
Christians,
Mm.
and I think that's interesting to me.
Mhm.
That there's all kinds of different moves you can make, um, but the idea that it's like, well, he got it wrong, therefore we're screwed.
Mhm.
End of story. Like that just never occurred.
It is interesting, and I think too the move that is often made of like taking the language of imminence that you'll find in different places, like to be ready, be alert, right?
Mhm.
That these theologians will latch onto that, but not in a way of kind of creating an eschatological crisis, but as a way of intensifying kind of the
Mhm.
demand for obedience and discipleship in the present. I
Mhm.
think that's also a resource too
Mhm.
for Christians
Absolutely.
today,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I
Absolutely.
think, and to be fair to Boltmann, I mean, even if there's things I disagree with him, I think that's really what he's trying to do. Is he's saying, look, like you're only looking at these passages in a very selective way. If you're just talking about predictive prophecy, these things have like an ethical component to them that you need
Yeah.
to wrestle with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Boltmann was great in terms of like drawing out the existential implications of the gospel message for people. Like he was an incredible preacher and teacher. I mean, who was it? Someone was sharing with me, like, hearing him lecture, kind of a thing. Like it was just the most compelling, vision. But then it was like, yeah, but he doesn't actually believe the reality behind it, like resurrection and all that kind of stuff. The implications of it, though, really great, in terms of like setting that out. So yeah, for sure. Well, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. I mean, obviously, this is hugely complicated, but I want our listeners to hear that it is uh, the historical work does have theological implications, and it's totally fine, for you to be thinking through and wrestling through those things. But also, I guess I would just put in a plug to say that, as you wrestle through those things, don't hesitate to actually do the work of going back and see how other Christians have thought about this, because it's not like this becomes it's just something 19th, 20th century scholars just happen to discover in the tradition, right? It's something that Christians have been thinking about for a very long time, and it's not something that I think should in any way lead to like a crisis of faith or anything like that. So
Yeah, yeah,
good.
I agree.
Yeah, yeah. So what else? Anything else, Tucker? Anything else you'd want to add about the book? Obviously, there's plenty more
Hmm.
we could say, but
I mean, yeah, I'm just curious to see, how it's going to be received. I really enjoyed writing it,
Mhm.
and I hope, like I mentioned to you earlier, Max, I hope my reconstruction's convincing to people. But even if it isn't, I hope that especially the reception history stuff
Mhm.
is meaningful for biblical scholars, and especially thinking about like the reception of Jewish messianism and
Mhm.
the caricature of Jewish messianism in Christian circles, just to be, I notice in my own teaching context, like if I was to pull out actually like the theological implications of this project,
Mhm.
I'm less comfortable talking about the kind of import of the delay of the parousia, right? Because I need to think more and talk with people better qualified to answer that. But I think one theological implication would certainly be for Christians to be more careful and
Mhm.
thoughtful about how they talk about Jewish messianism, and how the kind of easy way Christians will slip into, creating this Jewish foil for Jesus as the Messiah.
Mhm.
And it's just not necessary. Like, and
Mhm.
it actually shows some anxiety there and some insecurity about it, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
We don't have to do that to
Mhm.
also appreciate what Jesus is doing and saying in his context. So,
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's really well said. Yeah, there's a really, really weird thing that happens in Christian preaching, teaching, where everything that is positive, that we think is positive about Judaism, we take it from Judaism and just give it to Jesus, and then everything we think that is negative about Judaism, we just say we take it from Jesus and import it on Jews, and that's a very very problematic way of doing things, and entirely it's not historically accurate, and it's entirely unnecessary. So I appreciate you drawing our attention to that very much. Well, thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for the book, Tucker. Again, everybody, you can check it out. Jesus and his promised second coming. Looking forward to seeing the waves that this book makes, Tucker. What did Joel Marcus is? I liked his endorsement of the book. This is what did he say? Setting the cat among the pigeons or something like that. So I like that. I think that's a good expression. Awesome, man. All right.
Thanks
Good
so
stuff.
much, Max.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.